I tried. Just have to stand up.
Can everyone hear me? So we'll get started in maybe 30 seconds. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here today, both in person and on the screen. I have to say it is great to see so many people in the room and see faces that I haven't seen in months and over a year. And for those of you on the screen too, it's great to see you. President Price regrets his absence today, but he's traveling for Duke and is unable to be here both either in person or on Zoom. So as we begin, I have a few reminders. One is after we hear Provost Kornbluth's presentation today, we're going to turn to the Q&A and we're going to revert to prior protocol. Please be sure to say your name, department, or school when you raise your hand to ask a question, because this helps us record the minutes. And for those of you who are in the room, you should see attendance sheets being circulated. And again, just initialize as we once did, a year and a half ago. And for those of you on Zoom, Mariah or Sandra will just take down your names because they can see it on the screen. So we're going to begin with the first order of business today, which is the approval of the September 23rd meeting minutes. These were posted with today's agenda. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Okay, may I have a motion to approve the minutes? A second? Great. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? Great, thank you. The minutes are approved. I'd also like to add, in terms of our last meeting in September, I received a number of emails following the meeting from colleagues across Duke, sharing how much they really enjoyed the presentation on Duke's COVID modeling approach. And with that, again, I'd like to thank Drs. Tom Denny and Cam Wolf and Professor Steve Haas and Vice President Kyle Kavanaugh for sharing, the background and the data and that goes into helping us manage the pandemic. And for those of you who want to go back and watch the presentation, it is on Academic Council's YouTube channel, and it's on where it's the Council Corner tab. And you can also watch all of last year's presentations there too as well. So with that, we're going to move to our sole agenda item for today, which is a presentation from Provost Kornbluth regarding the faculty survey. And this is a survey that is conducted every 5 years, and it goes out to all regular rank faculty at Duke. And so with this, I'd like to turn it over to Provost Kornbluth. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much. Also nice to see some of you, at least half of you, from the upper nose up in person, and try to also take a look on the screen. So let me find the slides here. Oh, even better. All right, terrific. Thank you so much. Great, thank you. And then. Okay, thanks so much. So as Erica just said, this is a survey that's given every 5 years. So if you've been here a while, you've taken the survey a few times and seen the reports a few times. This particular version of it was administered between October 2nd and November 8th of 2020. So really just in the height of the pandemic. But the questions were largely similar to last time, although there were some additions. I really want to thank David Jameson Drake, who's here, and his team for putting together and administering the survey. And the response rate was quite good. It was 62.5%. with a demographic profile really almost identical to the demographic profile of the population of faculty. So I think the results are robust. So one other comment is the data I'm going to be presenting are aggregated across mostly, there's some breakout data of schools, but mostly aggregated across the whole university. And obviously that can wash out some results or, lead to sort of somewhat, misleading impression in terms of the results. But David's team has prepared sort of equivalent data for the schools, and they will be shared with the deans, who will, I assume, share with the faculty in the school. So you should be able to see the breakout data for your own unit. Once you get down to very small units, like small departments, it becomes difficult, obviously, because we don't want to have individuals identifiable from the survey data. So with that, the survey had a huge amount of data, but the things I'm going to be presenting today are really an overview of some of the key findings. And I'm happy to discuss or answer any questions, as are others here who know about this. So overall satisfaction, we're going to talk about satisfaction in different areas of the university. You'll see some trends over time. I mentioned that this survey has been given every 5 years. We do some comparisons from 2010 to 2015 to 2020. So you can see how things are advancing. We've got questions and answers around diversity, equity, inclusion, shared values, and retention. In the last three of these, some of these questions are new since the previous survey, so we don't necessarily always have longitudinal data, but I think you'll still get an idea of the status of things at the moment. So let's start with overall satisfaction. So overall satisfaction remains high across all ranks in schools. In other words, overall satisfaction with the role of faculty at the university. Faculty are most satisfied with the quality of intellectual stimulation and library resources. Faculty are most dissatisfied, not very surprising, startup funds, time for scholarly work and salary. So obviously time and money, sometimes space, are always sort of perennial unfavorites maybe. So, and I'll give you a little bit of now granular data around some of this. So let's start here. So what you're seeing here, so you see the bars are the percentage responding in each response category. It's centered on the middle, on the middle of the range of the middle response category, which is neither dissatisfied nor satisfied. And the dot that you see is the mean response. And that just gives us an ability to make easy comparisons. And you can see a few things. First of all, the overall satisfaction is fairly good. It's been fairly consistent over time. There was actually some drop in 2015 that has recovered, but how significant that is, I don't know, but it basically returned to pretty much historic averages. These averages have been fairly consistent over time with respect to overall satisfaction of the faculty role. Now, you can then break that down further, either by divisions in arts and sciences or by schools. There's some variability with arts and sciences, law and nursing slightly ahead in some cases, with Nicholas and the UICs slightly behind. I will mention that if a faculty member is in a UIC and a school, they only answered for one. So depends on where their primary affiliation is. And we do have regular ranked non-tenure track faculty members whose really only academic appointment is in a UIC. So this just gives you a general gist. And the question is, what is it that faculty found? As I mentioned in the overall satisfaction comments, what is it faculty found, to be good or bad? So this comparison, we broke out non-clinical faculty and clinical faculty because we've seen over time, obviously, there's some different concerns. And so I'm just going to look at my notes because it's hard to see on the side with the Zoom. So basically, as you can see, the non-clinical faculty were really happy with the quality of undergraduate students, the library resources, as I mentioned, intellectual stimulation of the work. Obviously, office space can be very variable. Again, this is an overall, the graduate and professional student quality and teaching responsibilities. The clinical faculty, somewhat variable, but about the same. including obviously the ability to give good clinical care. Oh, that's great. Now I can see. Perfect. Thank you. And so, you know, these levels of satisfied are somewhat or very satisfied are quite good. So what are faculty not as happy about? These are areas where the faculty were either somewhat or very dissatisfied. Again, non-clinical time, space for postdocs and graduate students, salary, startup, classroom space, committee and administrative responsibilities. I always like that the clinical has the quality of dining option. So I think the answer there is to like eat at the Broadhead and not in the hospital cafeteria. But in any case, they also were interested in startup funds, time for work, et cetera, et cetera. So again, if you look back over time, these are sort of perennial favorites. These are the areas, but you know, we'd have to really do a careful point-by-point comparison to see how much it's moved. Now, this is a complicated slide. So concerns overall with the quality of mentoring of faculty prompted the addition of specific mentoring questions to the survey. So compared to, this began in 2010, by the way. So compared to 2010, the 2020 results show higher satisfaction with mentoring across all of the ranks. But a significant percentage, you know, if you look, we're still, you know, hovering at 50% or lower, really thought they had adequate mentoring. There's one really interesting thing here that actually got pointed out in ECAC, which is if you look at the not applicable rank column, the percentage of faculty who were full professors who thought it was not applicable was higher in 2010 than in 2020. We've talked a lot about mentoring, but I think now more full professors are even realizing that they can still use various forms of mentoring. And so I think it's become applicable to more individuals. Let's look at research support. So this really has to do both with financial resources, but also, again, time, startup funds, support for securing grants, et cetera. We are getting better over time, I think, at all of these things. It's slow progress, but it's also likely, I have to say, that an impact on this is our assistant professors are getting better and better startups. So they kind of figure into it. So if you compare the sort of magnitude of startups that, you know, some of us got like 25 years ago, they were competitive, but maybe not super competitive. And I think we've really put a lot more effort into trying to make those kinds of investments. So then that's sort of the general sort of, you know, infrastructure, nuts and bolts kinds of things. And the question then is, if we look really specifically, and this really speaks to the environment in which faculty are doing their scholarship and teaching. If we look at diversity and equity and inclusion, it's kind of interesting, and I think we're going to want to discuss these data after I go through the presentation, which is compared to 2015, a larger percentage of faculty report that the commitment to diversity is demonstrated in their department or unit. So the institution, the schools, the departments are committed to this. However, minority and female faculty are less likely to agree that the climate and opportunities in their department and unit are equal. So there have been push in diversity, but still a perception of inequality. And minority and female faculty are more likely to agree that they have to work harder to be perceived as legitimate scholars. Now, one interesting thing here is you can talk about, and as you'll see in the slides in a minute, the commitment to diversity. There was not a specific question about commitment to inclusion, which is obviously not quite the same thing. So if you look here, commitment to diversity is demonstrated in my department or unit and somewhat or strongly agree. I think you can see, you know, that we've had an increase between 2015 and 2020. Obviously, there is variability from demographic group to demographic group, but in both minority and majority groups, there has been a perception that there really is a commitment to diversifying the environment. Now, if you look though at the climate, which speaks not only to diversity, but to inclusion, we look at the statement, I feel that climate and opportunities for minority or faculty in my department or unit are at least as good for those of non-minority faculty. So despite efforts to really diversify. And I also think to build a more inclusive environment, there are still clearly issues with belonging and inclusion. Asian females are the only group that showed some gains in perceiving climate opportunities being as good as for non-minority faculty. This is most pronounced among Black faculty of both genders and Hispanic females. And I would note that even white faculty note that minority colleagues have lost ground with respect to climate and opportunities. So I think this is a finding that flies in the face of a lot of the efforts we're making. And I really would like to discuss that at the end if folks are interested. I feel that the climate and opportunities for female faculty in my department or unit are at least as good as those for male faculty. There are small differences in perception among groups here over time. Similar to 2015, the males in general perceive more gender equity than the females. So again, that's not very shocking, but brushing under 50% is not obviously a robust feeling of equity among the female faculty. Next slide. This is really a perception of how people feel as scholars in the department. I have to work harder than some of my colleagues to be perceived as a legitimate scholar. This is particularly problematic for Black and Hispanic faculty members. Again, the biggest discrepancies are for Black and Hispanic female faculty. We've seen a small improvement, or at least not a worsening, for Asian faculty. And even among Caucasian faculty, we do see a discrepancy between males and females here. So, and by the way, we can make these slides available on the Academic Council website. So if people want to get a chance to scrutinize them, I know I'm flipping through them fairly quickly. So that's really a slate of questions that were directed towards diversity, equity, inclusion. There's a slightly different addition that was added this year, which has to do with shared values, related obviously to belonging and inclusion, but a little bit different. And basically, minority and female faculty are less likely to agree that the shared values of trust and inclusion are reflected in their department or unit. They're also less likely to agree that the academic leadership in their department effectively addresses unprofessional behavior among faculty. And then, perceptions of the effectiveness of school-level academic leadership in defending shared values varies by school. And, will, again, when schools drill into their individual school data, that will become more clear. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, but there are a couple interesting things to note here. So we're asking, to what extent your departmental culture reflects the following Duke shared values. As I mentioned, we have respect, trust, inclusion, but also discovery and excellence. So aside from the fact that males consistently seem to feel that the culture reflects values of respect, trust, and inclusion than do females, you'll note that the respect, trust, and inclusion questions and responses essentially track together. We do better overall with discovery and excellence, but again, as came out when I was discussing with ECAC, these are our bread and butter as an academic institution. If we're not doing well in discovery and excellence, there's a really big problem. And to some extent, the other values remain aspirational for some portion of our population. So I think this is extremely important as we reflect on the results of this survey. In the next slide, there are statements given, and we're asking the percent of someone, whether individuals somewhat or strongly agree. You will notice that Black faculty, again, are less likely to believe that the culture reflects Duke's shared values, and they were also less likely to believe that academic leadership could effectively address the situation when violated. And so those who are, experiencing a negative environment do not feel that in many cases that these problems are adequately addressed. So here, this is kind of interesting. So this, again, is a percentage that agree, somewhat or strongly agree. The academic leadership of my school effectively addresses situations when institutional values are challenged, or the academic leadership of my school effectively addresses unprofessional behavior among the faculty. So note that unprofessional behavior among the faculty appears to be less effectively addressed than overall challenges to abstract, if you will, institutional values. The issue, though, is obviously in the survey, there's some underlying variables here that can influence the results in any individual units. namely the gender or demographic distribution in the schools, the rank distribution in the schools, hiring distribution, et cetera. So, to some extent, there's a reflection of past difficulties too. There were schools that I won't go into the details here, but I will say if you'd asked them 5 years ago, you might have gotten a very different answer to what you see now. And so that's the value of getting a snapshot. But I think in some cases, the schools have effectively addressed issues from previous years. And so we see increases in percentage in some of those schools when we look back. Well, this exact question wasn't asked, but when we look at the sort of general tone in the school, it's improved. So another question, obviously, is when we look at the survey, one of our big interests is whether our faculty are happy here and whether they're likely to stay here. And if they were going to choose university to go to again, would they choose Duke? So overall, of deciding, again, most faculty would choose to come to Duke. And not surprisingly, the percentage increases with rank because, first of all, they have stayed here, and obviously they have more security. In deciding all over again, Black and Hispanic faculty are more likely to have second thoughts or would choose not to come to Duke. And, again, potential reasons for leaving Duke vary by rank, but salary tops the list for all ranks. And, there are places that obviously offer much higher salary, and we often see that in our sort of retention bargaining. So the data, these are the data that underlies what I just was talking about. I would choose to come to Duke. I would have second thoughts. I would choose not to come to Duke. Overall, the percentages of folks who would not come to Duke is sort of gratifyingly low. But again, you see some differences higher in Black females, in particular, Asian females, and so Hispanic males. And so we're really, it would still be good to know more. And, often we try to do exit interviews with folks who we are not able to retain. And, in some cases, in some units, it does shed light on environments that are less than welcoming for individuals. The next slide is, to what extent have you considered the following as a reason to leave Duke? So these are faculty that are still here, obviously. So these reasons have not yet been compelling enough for them to go. But you can see that, increasing salary, finding a more supportive work environment, time, sometimes teaching loads can vary quite a bit from institution to introduce, reducing stress, et cetera. There were some responses which were very low number responses, including retirement, to lower cost of living, to enhance your careers in other ways. So I thought that was of interest. And finally, this is an array that I think Pat Hull did that is very nice, which basically, if you have an open-ended question, what keeps you at Duke? It varies in rank between 1 and 10 from different ranks of the professoriate, colleagues, so you can all feel good that you will like each other across the board, or the number 1 response. There's a couple of anomalies, like assistant professors rank students as number 10. I'm not sure what that is. But other than that, there's not like huge discrepancies or anything, very surprising between the ranks. So that is like the whirlwind tour overview of all of the data. There is a huge amount of data. As I said, we have school-specific data, but I think, David, there's also ways for folks to dig in more deeply to the data in Tableau, the raw data. So we could talk about that further. But I'd like to open up to discussion, basically, questions I'm happy to answer, or others here, but also just reflections on the data and what you think they need. We also have, let's put this back. Back so we can see the hands as well.
And remember to introduce yourself both here and on the screen.
Hollywood Squares, look here. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Floor is open. Comments, questions? Trina.
Sally, can you define Hispanic for us? Is that an ethnic group or is it a racial category for purposes of the survey?
Question, David?
That's from the HR files. I believe it's an ethnic, it's treated as an ethnic group for federal guidelines.
So could that include people who identify as Asian and Black as well as white in that category for our purposes?
Correct. If one identifies ethnicity of Hispanic, plus anything else, they're categorized as Hispanic.
I'd like to follow up on the information about diversity, equity. Because I saw some of this data on another university committee. Striking was that in the climate part of the survey, Black faculty reported worse results on every question than any other group.
Yeah,
And
that's
so I'm really
interesting.
curious about what the university's strategy is to address
Right.
these climate issues. Do we have an overall university strategy, not limited to specific schools?
Right.
We're addressing that particular concern and the larger concern, right? These data reveal with regard to women and diversity.
Absolutely. So let me back up before we talk a little bit about the kinds of things we might be doing is to like what's underlying these results, because I've been thinking about the contrast between people feeling there's a greater commitment to diversity and possibly inclusion that I don't know, but certainly I can tell you from the sort of central administration, this is something obviously we've been serious about, but obviously not having the impact we would like. And the question is it a lagging indicator? And we're going to see some change in the survey that I don't know. I don't think the pandemic would impact that. Or is it really our measures we're taking are not working? In other words, it's the wrong remedy for the disease. In other words, we're throwing activity at it, and is it not the right activity? The other thing is the heterogeneity of units. Obviously, good things will get washed out as well as bad things, but we really need to see if there are units looking through these data. Are there units that are really doing this right? In other words, folks feel better about the environment or not. And so that's another thing to think about in terms of going forward action to really see if there are any model units or not, or are we all kind of in the same place? And the other question I have is that I think, because of our rhetoric, because of the aspirations, we've been talking seriously about this, and I think we have appropriately raised expectations. Question is, are we in a way falling even shorter of what, because of the expectations and the rhetoric we've given around this topic? So we have to think about that. But in terms of what we're doing, I think aside from the climate survey, I feel like there are indicators that we're moving the needle. First of all, our recruitment of Black faculty has been excellent this year, and our retention has been much better. So over the last 4 years, the number of Black faculty on the campus side, at least, has increased from 67 in the fall of 17 to 90 in the fall of 21. Okay, so that's an overall increase in the population from 5.9% to 7%. It's not enough. We're also winning, and I don't have the numbers here, but we're winning a lot more retention battles with minority faculty. So there's some objective data to suggest at least we're increasing the diversity. Respect to inclusion, important question. I'm a little bit stymied what to do with the unit level. I honestly think a lot of this is very local. And the question is, and I'd love a discussion of this, how do you move the needle? Okay. So unfortunately, one or two, and I will say also in other harassment sort of surveys, the survey we did, the perception is that faculty treatment of other faculty underlies a lot of the problems in the units. And so the question is, are there units where one or two individuals who do not buy into an inclusive environment, are not interested in an inclusive environment, whether that's influencing these data? In other words, if you're in a unit that makes you very unhappy because of a number of individuals either targeting or bullying, or just not being, not including a minority individuals, that impacting it. We're trying very hard through Abbas's office, through Kim's office, to really obviously expand the educational offerings. And I will say, we are seeing a continuous uptick in uptake of faculty with interest in these topics and with really wanting to, I won't even call them training because they're workshops, they're discussions, et cetera. We are trying to focus energy in the appointment, promotion, and tenure process. We had a discussion yesterday. We will be encouraging people to be able to make statements about, if you will, the service tax for minorities and women who really wind up doing a disproportionate amount of service. We want people to reflect in their intellectual development statement and in their teaching statements on how they're encouraging a more diverse and inclusive environment. So we're trying to shine an institutional light on these being important for our overall environment. We've had a lot of success, I will say, and we've heard this from recent recruits. This is one of the reasons I want to come to Duke, is support for organic faculty-grown activities like the Black Bank Tank, like the writing group that's led by Tyson Brown and Sarah Gaither, that, you know, one way to compensate for maybe less than ideal environment in some individual unit, also create a university-wide belonging through organizations. And we're, I think soon, Abbas, you're doing another round of these where faculty can propose activities, et cetera. But, you know, we're trying to elevate scholars of color. As you'll see at the next meeting, we've done the first ever survey that addresses staff concerns, which we'll have to develop an action plan for. But, and, you know, Abbas, you may want to, I don't know if you have, if I've left anything out that you want to speak to.
Yes, I mean, so Sally mentioned, for example, the hiring initiative that we have in
You may
place.
need to come up, Abbas, because it's
Okay.
really hard to hear.
Or maybe I just stand up. Can you hear me? So,
I'll hear you on.
I'm not sure if they can hear you on the screen.
Oh,
That's
you can't hear me.
all.
So just a few things to share with you. So on the faculty hiring, Sally mentioned that's something that we launched when we started the office in fall 2017. So we had over 27 faculty, 15% of them are Black faculty. And that has really helped move the needle on the numbers to 7%. It's still not where we should be, but we are making progress on that. Now, that program is complemented with the training for search committees. And I was just looking at the numbers the other day. When we started this over 3 years ago, we had like, you know, small uptake, you know, 20, 30 per year. So far this fall, we are at 130 and we are expecting another 30 people. So by the end of the year, we'll have 160 members of search committees going through the training. Now, in terms of building community, because I think a lot of these things that you see in terms of climate are because of what's happening at the unit level, the departmental level, mental level. And that's where the challenges are, frankly. And so we are working with some groups to create some affinity groups at the campus level to create a sense of community for faculty. But that cannot be the only one. For example, Sarah Gaither and Tyson Brown have one that is really successful group. We are working with the Latinx faculty now on setting up a group for Latinx faculty this year. So that's one thing that we need to do. But really, and the training for APTs, I have started doing that every year because I sit on the APT committee. So every year at the beginning, before we start discussing dossiers, we go over biases that we see in dossiers. For example, how you evaluate scholarship, biases that you see in external letters in terms of language or perception of particular fields. We know that there is research, for example, on research on minority communities. That research sometimes in some disciplines is seen as niche or peripheral. It's providing perspective, not advancing theoretical debates and things of that nature. So these are the conversations that we have at the APT committee before we start discussing the dossiers. And we have seen really, to give credit to the APT committee, they have been very intentional about this. We have seen situations where colleagues at the unit level are not really as appreciative of the work of their colleagues, particularly on the represented faculty. And then the APT committee takes a different kind of look at it and say, that's really probably not a fair assessment of that faculty's research. So these are some of the things that we are doing. And there are other things that deep dives, for example, Charlene Black has been offering a course on, cultural awareness, how to work with students from different backgrounds. So we are moving beyond that, kind of workshop, but it's more like into deep dives into the issues. But frankly, the only thing that is going to move the needle in a significant way is work at the ground level, at the unit, where we need the help of chairs and we need the help of faculty, you, all of us as faculty here. Because lots of the issues that we see, it's a really faculty not treating other faculty well. It is how they evaluate the scholarship when it comes to promotion and tenure, how they treat them, whether they have, the faculty feel that they have a voice. Lots of these things that you see here, I can guarantee you, when you dig deeper into the unit, you are going to see that many of them are non-tenure system faculty, that they don't have a voice in their departments, that they are not treated well by the tenure system faculty and things like that, about how they are being treated. So we have a role, all of us, to play in how we conduct ourselves with each other, how we govern our units, and how we treat each other. But I think this, for us to make progress on this, it has to be a multifaceted approach. There is a role for us. We need to own this problem. I am, doing faculty advancement, so I share some of this responsibility here. I need to take that's Sally, the leadership, but also deans and chairs and us here, faculty.
For Valia. Valia, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. This is somewhat related. I wonder if there are any ongoing efforts attempting to find correlations between the results of this survey and some objective metrics of departments and academic units. I'm thinking, for example, correlations between faculty satisfaction and the number of students served of different levels, or faculty satisfaction and school administrative structure, number of supportive personnel, budget, etc.
That's a really interesting idea. It's not something that we've taken on, but I think it would be a really good idea because if I had to wager, I would say that those correlations are real, maybe not with budget, but faculty satisfaction and student participation. I mean, I've seen, we often in the review of graduate programs ask for, have private interviews with students as well. And there is actually a remarkable correlation between how the graduate students are perceiving their experience and how the faculty treat each other and the students. And so I would be very surprised, students vote with their feet and some of the other, the other parameters you mentioned. So I think that's a great idea.
But I can wait. Victoria's had a hand up for a while.
Okay, how about Victoria and then Natasha?
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Victoria Sabo, Art History and Visual Studies. I was wondering if there was any analysis done on tenure track versus non-tenure track faculty. And this also addresses a little bit what Abbas was just saying. How can we parse out some of these differences that we're seeing? Thank you.
The data exists. I don't know that we've had that plotted out. David, has that been actually generated as a separate report?
That is a separate report, but within reports, we have shown tenure track versus non-tenure track results, yes.
Okay, so we do have those results and they'll be available to the schools. We can provide that.
Management and public policy. The last slide, Sarah, you showed us that was really insightful. And I know we laughed at the humor about assistant professors complaining, but it made me really think, do we have information about how many of our assistant professors are required to teach core courses that are likely to be much more difficult and frankly would leave them with that kind of a negative opinion versus senior faculty members who are able to negotiate their way out of teaching some of those?
Right, so we don't have those data centrally. Those would definitely be something that would be variable from school to school. And actually different schools and indeed even different majors or departments have different practices in that regard. In other words, some really give the starting assistant professors a pretty big break on having to teach those either core courses or large courses. And some actually, that's where they put, assistant professors into the field. And I know, for example, in Sanford, everyone has to participate in these core, you're like, everyone unless there's negotiation. As opposed to that's right, everyone asterisk has to participate in these courses. So it really does vary from school to school a lot, what we have done. And, this would be a massive thing, but is really look at the, impact on scholarly productivity of the different requirements, but it's going to be very hard to do across fields because it's very difficult to compare what, productivity means in different settings.
But even get a summary from the schools might be helpful to understanding what's driving this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Cam Harvey, Fuqua. Can I ask the Dalia's question in a different context about correlation with objective measures? So I fully understand that when you do a survey, as faculty about salaries, most people want more. So there's some inherent bias, but I was struck by the 67.7% of the assistant professors listing salary as the #1 factor for retention. So the objective data, for example, would be a comparison to the peers that we aspire to be with to see if there is a problem, given that this is kind of noisy data. And maybe something that I was curious about, which is objective. What is the proportion of faculty that got a raise that covered the cost of living increase?
So,
Which is 5.4%.
right, so
So-
I promised, I told Erica before we started that because neither Daniel nor Jennifer could be here, we would take any financial questions and send them to reply to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, we obviously do salary equity study within the university. But, President Price has raised this issue just this year to really start taking a careful look at whether our salaries are competitive in the open market with other institutions. And that is something that we really need to take a careful look at. It's a little bit different in most fields at the very entry assistant professor level. We know, when we're negotiating with people that, we're basically in the market or we would never get those people, but how that falls apart over time as people advance through the ranks or it doesn't fall apart over time is something we just have never really taken a careful look at and we need to.
Okay, Stefan Bash Physics. And I have 3 comments. One directly to what you said. Salary and equity directly tracks with time at Duke. And I see those numbers as a department chair. I see it for all my faculty. And the longer they have been at Duke, the worse they are compared to peers that are recently hired at the
Yes.
same level.
Yes.
That item number 1. Item number 2 was the comment here about the assistant professors. I think their lack of appreciation for students may track with the fact that assistant professors have a much harder time attracting grad students
That's true.
compared to their senior colleagues in their early years at Duke. And so they may not value or be kept at the place here as tightly by students that they frankly haven't had a chance of attracting. The third last comment I wanted to make is on one of the slides where you showed somewhat disparity between the perception on how we do in climate and the perception on how we do with addressing individual poor behavior by faculty. And okay, this could be, of course, a real issue, but I think it could also be somewhat of a perception issue, since speaking now in my role as department chair, more than half of the interventions I do for poor behavior never see the light of day because I'm not allowed to talk about them.
That is true.
And
That is true.
my general population in my department doesn't realize that I try to do something.
No, I think that's a good point. Very good point. To your other points, a couple of comments. Aside from tracking the time, honestly, I remember this very clearly when I first became vice dean in the medical school and I actually saw all the basic science salaries. It was like a littered menu of past retentions. In other words, it's not just time that you've been here, it's willingness to look at other jobs, to come back and ask for, and that's a problem as an institution, obviously, and as we say, if you start threatening to leave, you better be ready to go. And we don't want to lose our best people because there are other, salary opportunities, but it's very clear there's like, a kind of vast gulf, even within some schools. There's obviously field discrepancies as well, but that's a different issue. The other graduate student thing is interesting that you said that because it really is different from area to area. Like I remember when I started as assistant professor in the med school, like all the graduate students only faculty. So it's really hard to know. But certainly there's a difference from field to field. And the students, it's often kind of not very heterogeneous within the department. They'll sort of migrate en masse.
Availability of funding plays a role.
That's exactly right. So if you're starting fresh out as an assistant professor and you have a startup and you now have, a 6-year runway, students feel pretty comfortable that you're not going to leave while they're, here and there's funding. Some departments have, imposed you can't take graduate students if you don't have a certain level of external funding. And so, but count startup dollars. So there's a lot of dynamics at play here.
I'm Carolyn Barnes from the Sanford School. I was curious about communicating the insights about diversity and inclusion to the units. How are you going to protect the faculty of color that are within those units, considering there's so few of us? So, in terms of having identifiable information, I'm sure when you communicate to whatever the Sanford School,
Right.
low morale among Black women, there's only 2.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm just saying, how is section 1? And, am I going to get called into the dean's office?
Yeah,
Maybe I'm communicating my own insecurity, but I think that's a
real problem. And,
Yeah.
we tend not to want to communicate any results where an N is less than 5.
Oh,
in
okay,
a
but then
group.
you might be overlooking some problems.
Yeah, no, I
The
know.
reason
So
why
that is a question. And, I hadn't really thought about that in terms of your school, for example, because, in the larger schools, we're not communicating it at the department level directly, except, the dean is going to get an overall summary. And that's a little bit different, obviously, in a smaller school, which is essentially a department. So thank you for raising that. Let me just give that a little bit more thought.
Oh, and the other question I had was, are the response rates different by racial group?
I think, as I mentioned, they actually reflect the percentage in the population. So for example, you get it. Anyway, yeah, so there's not some huge skew with respect to response. Sina.
Thank you very much. I understand that the comparison between the salary of different institutes is a difficult issue. But shouldn't the increase in the cost of living in Durham, and especially when the Duke itself increases the cost, for example, for its childcare, associated childcare service, multiple times the amount that they have, Duke has increased the salary of its faculty, shouldn't they be at least at the same level? That when Duke increases its cost for people to live and work there, shouldn't at least increase the salary at the same level?
Right. So as I indicated, I think we're going to be taking a really careful look at salary structure over the next year. And, I hear what you say, and I certainly will convey this, discuss this with the president, with EVP Ennis, et cetera. But I definitely hear what you're saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kathy Andolsek from Columbia Science School of Medicine. I want to go back to really a couple of comments around objective measures that we have and folding those into this. I guess, given that there's underrepresented faculty, given the fact that unfortunately there are a few of them as a group and see salaries on target with other people, and they're saying.
Yeah, so we do that.
And promotion, and whether
Yes.
they're getting promoted compared to the last 5 years. Have we
Yes.
moved the needle at all on any of these other measures that might have meaning? And maybe it's too short of a time, but one would hope in 5 years to see something beyond the efforts to improve.
Right.
And
So
the second question I just have quickly, just before I end, is that last slide I found really interesting. And the one thing that I guess I kind of found bad is a low sense of value and meaning.
Yeah.
And I just.
I have to look back at the slide. Let me look at the slide again. Let me just answer your first question first, which is we look every other year internally in a salary equity study. And actually we do well in terms of equity across racial groups and gender within units. Now, the issue is in some areas, there's gender inequity, mainly because in some of the higher paid fields, there's actually fewer women. So,
Get that.
you know, but within units, we do see equity. And honestly, when we see an outlier, we address those individual salaries with the dean when they seem to be inexplicably off the equity line. So you were talking about feeling valued, making a contribution. Yeah, I see what you're saying. In a rank of 10, that's, you kind of would wish that would be number 1 or 2, you know? Betsy.
All right, thank you for the presentation. I'm not remembering the survey. Did it have any questions about LGBTQ identity? And I was wondering how those, if that was included, how inclusion panned out across LGBTQ groups.
No, I don't recall specifically, David.
Yes, that was one of the demographic factors that we asked about. But there have so far in all the years we've done the survey been too few to characterize as a group.
Got it. So did you hear that, Betsy?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Questions?
Josh.
Yeah, hi. Joshua Sokolov, physics. I have a very general question. Maybe it's more of a comment, but I'd like to hear your take on it. You know, when we look at the answers to these survey questions, and we see that some of them, you know, the good answer is only coming up 50% of the time, and you know, we obviously see that as cause for concern because in other cases we see answers, you know, 75% of faculty are somewhat satisfied or very satisfied. My question is, or my comment is, 75% is not that high, right? To think that 25% of the faculty won't even say that they're somewhat satisfied is concerning to me. And that, you know, that number showed up, I forget which slide it was, but in the context of presenting data like this, where you see other cases where there are more obvious problems, it makes 75% look like a good response. So I guess my question is, how do you interpret the absolute numbers as opposed to just the relative ones? And can we compare those to, say, other institutions?
Right, so a couple things. One is, I must confess that the newer questions do pose a problem to me. I'm much more interested in the relative progress over time. I'm not sure if the absolute numbers are incredibly meaningful. That's the first thing. The second thing is we don't really have a control experiment here. In other words, if you were to put something down like, you know, do you like, you know, beautiful sunshiny days, we might get 75%. You know, I just don't know. I mean, I'm not to be too flippant about it, but I don't know what that 75% means in terms of really, you know, satisfaction. So I think we can best continue the survey and compare. Now, our survey is somewhat idiosyncratic. There are questions, I think, and again, I'm going to look to David to talk about what happens at other institutions, but I don't know that we have a head-to-head means of direct comparison in terms of that satisfaction. Am I incorrect in that?
A little bit.
Okay, good. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, this is a faculty survey is conducted by other AAU institutions. We do it on a 5-year cycle, and each time we're able to find 4 or 5 other institutions who, within plus or minus 2 years, have administered the survey to their faculty. And we haven't done the comparative result yet, which is why you didn't recognize it. But we do have comparative results for each of the prior 3 surveys.
Well, that would be really interesting to put forward based on this, but also, my sense is also we do add idiosyncratic questions as well.
Yes, we do. Yes,
Yeah.
we do.
Okay.
Can I ask David?
Where we look at with the AAU institutions include the 20 private universities, and we generally select our peer groups from those schools like MIT, Harvard, Princeton. We try to make a robust comparison group each time, and so far we've been able to. We compare very well. Other faculty, we're very similar. It looks like you faculty are in the same world. Dealing with a lot of the same problems, similar concerns expressed at a similar level also. It doesn't look remarkably different from other elite private institutions.
So the good news about that is we don't look remarkably different from other elite institutions. The bad news is that the issues where we feel like we're making such intense efforts to move the needle, which is true to some extent at every peer school, but in different ways. And this comes back to Trina's original question is, how do we move the needle? And, Abbas's comment about the local culture from the ground. So we would hope that with intentional effort, we can compare favorably to our peers on some of these measures.
Hi, I'm Madam Law in nursing, and I recognize there's a number of ways to slice these data, but one thing that I think would be potentially interesting to look at is the improvements among the faculty that were in multiple cohorts of assessment. So those restricting it to just looking at those that did 2020 and 2015, rather than seeing, how much the change is accounting for all the new faculty that have joined within the last 15 years to see if there's been an improvement or change amongst those that have been multiply assessed.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously the surveys are de-identified, but you could have a checkbox that says, did you take the survey in the following years? We don't have.
Never done
we've
that,
never
but
done
that's a
that.
neat idea.
How long have you been at Duke?
I have the last question. Somewhere.
Yeah, I'll only ask if there are no other questions.
No.
So we did another survey in the spring. Are we going to get feedback on that survey at some point?
Next meeting.
Yeah, next meeting, great. And then the second question is, Abbas talked about, and by the way, the Academic Council recommended the establishment of your office, so I think we could pat ourselves on the back for that. So Abbas talked about the increase in the number of African-American professors or Black professors who've been hired. Can we keep data and get comparative data across groups about retention of faculty? Because I think that would be really interesting to line up with this data about hiring, right? Yeah. Maybe this is a question for David, right? Do we have the ability to go back and look at groups and make a determination about whether there are disparities in terms of our rates of retention and promotion?
Yes, and we do. And Sally and Abbas have that data.
Yeah, we do. That's what I was going to say. Well, you might comment on Abbas, but basically we're seeing. So it's we don't want a treadmill like every time we hire somebody leaves. So we're actually making real progress when you compare hiring and retention. But I don't know if you want.
That is true. Small progress, but we are making progress on retention. And I think this, and the credit goes to the faculty and the chairs and the deans who work so hard on that. But let's say, for example, the affinity groups that we are working with, they have been really instrumental in recruiting, but also in retaining faculty. So there is something that we can build on there, but we can certainly get you the data and share it with you.
Good to be back. And I'm glad we allocated like the full session today. We were thinking we were going to have additional items, but clearly these are important issues that we need to continue discussing. And we will continue to discuss issues such as faculty retention, salary issues. So we will have, the agenda will get fuller as we move on. With that, I want to thank everyone for coming out today, both in person and online. This meeting is adjourned and we will see everyone on November 18th.